Well, we are at the top of the hour, and welcome everybody from across the globe. We are delighted you're with us either right now or seeing this as a recording. Uh, Welcome to this landmark uh, inaugural session with three outstanding people who reflect the essence of the geroscience hypothesis that multiple chronic diseases and cancer can be targeted to some extent collectively by understanding their root causes and reacting accordingly. We have amazing panelists, and I won't take any more time, but to say that we are delighted, we're honored to have all three of them. And I would ask that Peter Libby take the mic in a moment after Thomas Sir, the executive director of Catalyst Institute, gives a few housekeeping announcements.
Thanks, and just a housekeeping reminder to enter any questions for the speakers in the Q&A function on our Zoom webinar platform, and the moderator will try to get to them as time allows. Similarly, with the questions that you posed at the time of registration. As usual, a link to this recording, the slides, transcript, and the chat will be circulated to all registrants and made publicly available within the next day or two. Maybe the transcript will take a little longer because it needs to be proofed. A distinctive feature of our virtual conference sessions is that we enable the chat function for audience interaction. So just for warm up, those of you who are willing, please say hi in the chat, your affiliation if desired, and from where you're logging in. But I want to now turn the mic over to Catalyst founder and president, Dr. Alexander Fleming. Zan?
Thanks again, Thomas. And gosh, this is so exciting to put these three distinguished people together. I will start by asking Dr. Peter Libby what got him interested in the intersection of cancer and cardiovascular disease, and he will take it from there. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, my journey to this omnibus approach to many chronic and even acute diseases linked by inflammation really echoes what Monica was saying during the run-in session here. And you chose the topic of this fireside chat, the shared roots of diseases, and focused in particular on cancer and chronic diseases that are related to aging, with the idea of not stamping out disease so much as improving longevity. I think that that's a theme which all three of us panelists today share. And maybe, I've been thinking about this issue for quite a while, and maybe you could show my slide number 3, which I think is a complicated slide. I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but it really makes a point that Monica was making, and that is that there are common mechanisms and mediators in cancer and in many other diseases, the one that I spend most of my time with, atherosclerosis. So this slide shows that on the top there, that perhaps the instigators, the primum movens, are different in cancer and in garden variety atherosclerosis. In cancer, we think that somatic mutations are very important in setting the malignancy in motion. And Monica Bertagnolli really spent a lot of her career in thinking about the genetic basis of cancer. And on the other hand, atherosclerosis involves all of the traditional risk factors that everyone in the audience can recite by heart. But once you get that machine rolling, the mechanisms and the mediators are actually common. And they are mechanisms, as Monica pointed out, that actually are important in all tissues at all stages of life and are essential for survival. So you see that the principal pathologic processes are really shared between cancer, oncogenesis, and atherosclerosis, as shown in the outer margins. We call them different things, but they're really mechanistically precisely aligned. And if you look in the middle column, many of the pathways and mediators between atherosclerosis and cancer are common. So this really sets the stage for a lot of our thinking about the commonality. I'm I'm a lumper rather than a splitter, and I really think that we all study the same disease, and we just call the cells and the pathways different depending on what floor of the research building our laboratories are on, but the mechanisms are really quite common. So Zan, maybe I can introduce the panelists, and we can take my slide away. So I'm really very honored and pleased to be joined by Monica Bertagnolli today, who's a relatively recently appointed director of the NIH with all of its institutes. And she came to the Institute from the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and the Harvard Medical School, where she was the Richard Wilson Professor of Surgery. And I knew Dick Wilson, and sometime we can share some stories about Dick Wilson. I think probably Victor Dzau remembers him as well. And as I mentioned, she had a wonderful career, not only clinically, but also in the laboratory working on inflammation and genetics as mechanisms of cancer. So we're very pleased to have her here today. And then Victor Dzau, and Victor and I were residents together and worked together for many, many years, is currently the president of the National Academy of Medicine. And he is really polytalented. But in particular, he has had a very deep and abiding interest over the last half dozen years or so in healthful aging. And he launched the grand challenge in healthy longevity of the National Academy of Medicine, and has really been devoted to achieving healthy human longevity, and thinks that it's a global problem, not just a local problem of the developed world. So welcome, Monica and Victor. Monica, you're trained as a surgeon, and when I was in training, the mantra of the surgeons was a chance to cut is a chance to cure. But you've been interested in prevention. So how did you go full circle from surgery to cancer prevention?
Oh, what got me to prevention was actually, when you think about it, there is a surgical version of prevention. So when I was a resident, this is when I was very interested in tumor immunology. I spent 3 years in Steve Burkhoff's lab at the Farber studying tumor immunology. And at that time, I met a patient in the VA, who had a genetic cancer predisposition syndrome, adenomatous polyposis coli, and he had this horrible desmoid tumor, a sarcoma. Looks like a dense inflammatory reaction under the microscope. He had this horrible desmoid tumor. And unfortunately, that desmoid tumor eventually took his life while I was caring for him. And that led me thinking in the field of immunology. We're now 1987, 88 here, actually even before the APC gene had been sequenced. What was the relationship between that genetic syndrome and these tumors that looked like dense inflammatory reactions? And then the final little piece of this story, we could talk about biology forever, but but we're talking about how I first got interested. The other piece of this story is, at that time, another surgeon who was trained at MGH, a guy named William Waddell, was at the University of Colorado. And he had a patient with a desmoid tumor and published a paper in 1987. He was trying to treat the desmoid with an anti-inflammatory drug, Sulindac. He gave it to that patient, and it didn't do a darn thing for the desmoid tumor, but all of that patient's intestinal adenomas went away. So he gave it to a cousin, and then a sibling of the cousin. And there was this little case report that came out from Bill Waddell in 1987, the very same time I took care of that patient, showing that this anti-inflammatory drug completely eliminated neoplastic lesions in the gut. So that's what got me started on the path. And yes, it really was prevention, and it was a couple of surgeons thinking about it.
It's so interesting, because what you just recounted, with starting with the patient, with a single patient, really makes the case for the physician investigator And your predecessor, Jim Weingarten, was perhaps the first to talk about the endangered species, and the endangered species of the physician investigator or the clinical investigator seems to be rediscovered periodically. And although it's an endangered species, I'm honored to be in the company of two distinguished physician scientists here who do retain contact with the patients, which I think is very important. So, Monica, what are the near-term prospects for cancer and chronic disease prevention? I think also there's the individual, the N of one, but there's also societal issues. For example, environmental pollution and mutagens that we may encounter in the environment. So what are some of the near-term prospects? And I'm sure that you've thought deeply now about the role of NIH in addressing these prevention issues.
Yeah, and we've even, I think, a recent report just out this very last week showing that some cancers can be created without DNA, without mutations, that epigenetics, which truly is the interaction with the environment that produces most epigenetic changes, can be the sole cause, sole inciting event of a cancer. So, our health is determined by the genes we inherit and the environment, including the societal factors that surround us. And we know that that even begins before birth. And truly understanding the fundamental biology of what that means is true, to me, is truly the way to prevention. Obviously, we already know many of the environmental factors, lifestyle factors that, going back to Sir Percival Potts, that we know if we have to eliminate them from the environment if we want to prevent cancer. But we can do so much more. And then finally, I'll say that underlying the fundamental underlying causes of cancer, which is why that we're here today, also has so many ties to the underlying fundamental causes of so many other diseases of the lifespan.
It's interesting that you raised the epigenetic changes, because the exception to the traditional risk factors is clonal hematopoiesis, which, as you know, for the last 10 years, I've been pursuing in relation to cardiovascular and other chronic diseases with your former colleague, Ben Ebert. Although I said that the traditional risk factors we all can recite are up on top in athro, with aging, I think that accumulating epigenetic changes due to clonal hematopoiesis, or that cause clonal hematopoiesis or associated with clonal hematopoiesis, is something. So, Victor, you've been involved in a great deal of productive basic science, and what has spurred your abiding interest in targeting healthy longevity, other than that we both have gray hair?
Well, I can tell you why I joined this meeting. Because when I was invited by Zen and others, they say, Monica's gonna be there, Peter's gonna be there. I said, it's like, oh, homecoming. We all did Brigham together, different faces. I certainly remember, Monica, when you have pigtails. I'm teasing. And Peter, he and I had many war stories to tell as our residency days. And of course, later on, I was chair of medicine at the Brigham, and Peter was chief of cardiology. When I think about this issue, you talk prevention. Well, it also dates, like Monica, through my own journey in becoming a physician scientist. As I was at the Brigham seeing patients and trying to determine what I should do with my life, because I talked to Jim Brownwall, all our mentors, and others, and Cliff Barger, another mentor of ours, I became interested in the idea of cardiovascular disease. The question is, in which area? And at that time, hypertension would just begin to get the attention because of discovery of renal angiotensin. So I decided that's what I'm going to do. And of course, I saw patients. I became the head of hypertension Brigham and the BI at one point. And of course, just like Monica, patients became a driving force in trying to find ways in which we can treat them. But it became very clear that if you're a cardiologist seeing people with cardiovascular disease, and the Framingham study in 1950s showed the risk factors became very obvious that prevention is the way to go. And hence hypertension, my interest, that of course broadened much bigger to many other areas. But that's in fact how I started the journey in deciding to work with Cliff Barger and Ed Haber and Mass General to purify renin and get inhibitors. At that time, there were no blockers of renin-angiotensin system. Our early work in looking at synthetic inhibitors and antibodies showed, boy, we can really lower blood pressure. And, Peter, you remember days I had to go over to the physiology department to do dog studies, right? And inducing hypertension. But that really is what got me very excited, that you can really see a disease and you can find the mechanism and you can find ways to treat it. And of course, now we think about a lot more than diseases. We want to prevent these diseases. But the fundamental issue, I think we all have the common denominator, is our fundamental experience in our training, in our research pathways, in what the ethos of medicine, what we want to do is to take bench to bedside. Because today, for me, it's bench to bedside to population, to entire society. But it's the same model, which we all grow up with. So that's the whole issue. And later on, I'd like to tell you more how we got into this whole area of aging, which I think is clearly a continuum of the biology, of course, of what we talk about.
Well, I don't think you have to wait. Why don't we delve right into the relationship between aging and these processes that we're talking about in chronic disease?
Okay. Unlike you and Monica, I do not have any slides. I can't say I prepared myself as if I'm giving a talk, but that being said, I would like to give some background because, it's so amazing. Society advances with science, technology, hygiene, vaccine, you name it, that we've seen almost doubling of life expectancy in the last century. And despite the fact we now have some challenges in the United States, overall, we're seeing a significant lengthening of life. But if you look at the data globally, it's really quite astounding that, in fact, in 2020, there are more people living over 65 than kids are 5 years or younger, which means we're getting to be a really aging society and that the fertility is going down. And so we really have to figure out what are we going to do with this phenomenon. And of course, we all know about this, as you already have said, you, Monica, aging is associated with a lot more chronic disease, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, 3 to 4 times higher, depending on what age group you're talking about, Alzheimer's. And of course, the issue for aging, to me, is an expression of the entire life cycle and the life cycle biology of how cells, rejuvenate and rejuvenate and die, and etc., and of course, inflammation. But as you pointed out, the important issues of aging is to achieve health and avoid the disease. And we all know that achieving health longevity is very complex. It's not simply a great healthcare system, but great prevention, and importantly, social issues, economic issues that elderly people have, environmental issues, and of course, the whole thing about longevity dividend, what they do with their life. So that's really the scene behind this. The way I got into this is that when I became the president of IOM, and now AM, by the way, I was the last president of IOM, the last emperor. And then AM, we decided what is our big ideas, the grand challenge. It became very obvious that aging is one of them. So the only way that you can address an issue like aging is to do a true full-scale work and looking at public-private partnership, bold ideas, and try to really address this issue. It became very obvious to us that the science of aging at that time, about 10 years ago, was really nowhere the way it is today, where there's so much excitement. So we decided the first thing we need to do is to think about how to increase research, which we now call neuroscience. And we try to, as we talk about later, create different ways to capitalize research through prizes competition. We also look at how to engage society, government, and others to enhance health longevity. Hence, we've been doing many studies, including a long report called Healthy Longevity. So that's how I got into it. I don't want to occupy all the time because there's so much to discuss, but that's the background. Happy to talk about the details of the things that we're all talking about, mechanisms, what NAM's been doing, what we have been doing with NIA, and of course, many other issues related to aging, and of course, how we've been engaging governments all over the world about creating health and longevity society.
Yeah, Monica, you had prepared some slides which really give us some data that underlie the aging society and the challenge of trying to do better here in the US.
Yeah, no, and I'm happy to run through these. And what I'm trying to do, I guess, let me just say as a start, in my role as director of NIH of the United States, it's been very clear that we need to take a very careful look at what's happening in our own country, in our own environment, understand what we can learn in comparison to the other nations of the world, and also take a comprehensive approach that lets us think about what do we need to drive, how can our research help drive health across the entire lifespan. So I have a few thoughts if you want to bring up the slides, please. So next one, please. Well, here's one that I think we all have to think about. You know, Victor's been talking about how we've had tremendous progress in our life expectancy, but not so much lately. And if you see here, you can see beginning in 2000, life expectancy was increasing, but by about 2014, it leveled off. We had a dip from the pandemic that we still have not fully recovered from. And in fact, early data tells us that we're still sliding when it comes to life expectancy, not increasing. The National Academies Medicine produced a really lovely report looking at the reason for this. And believe it or not, it's not so much in our much older citizens, it's in people in midlife, for which we in the United States have some significant health challenges. Next slide. But even our life expectancy is poor compared to our comparator nations. Yet we spend so much more per capita for healthcare. This is what I mean by we really need to learn from our from partners in other countries to help us understand what are the root causes of some of this this lack of progress we've had overall in having every citizen live a very long and healthy life. Next slide. And then this is another point that I make. I'm using data from the field of oncology, but as Peter said, you know, we also think very deeply about the doctor at the bedside, because really that is where all health starts. And if this is just an example from oncology, what kind of data do our doctors and patients have to make decisions in the clinic together? And it's not so great. I mean, it's okay, but if you look at this is from oncology. About 7% of the data used to make guidance-based decisions in the clinic is based on the highest level of evidence from randomized uniform consensus clinical trials. Everything else is less. And the bigger point of this, first of all, cardiology we've looked at as well is almost exactly the same. And the other big point to make is this hasn't changed in a decade. We haven't moved the needle on this in a decade. Next slide. So what are we going to do? How are we going to start to address the big changes we need to be able to understand biology for the entire lifespan? And the approach that we are adopting now at NIH are two things. First of all, eliminate silos between diseases and take a full lifespan approach to our research. And the practical, effective way we're going to start immediately is to conduct our research in the primary care environment. Primary care will allow us to involve all communities in research, think of disease, all the all the mediators of health, mental health, environment, socioeconomic status, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, cancer screening. All of this happens in the primary care environment. And believe it or not, this environment has been vastly under-resourced and underappreciated as a source of data for health. Next slide. And then the second, and then again, this environment, the research that we put into the primary care environment can come from really very comprehensive view of health across the lifespan. And this is just giving an example that we've already been talking about, the GLP-1 agonists, for instance, which can affect so many of the drivers of multiple chronic conditions, chronic inflammation, metabolic syndrome, and even immunity. And you can see here on this slide that this ties into so many of the changes that the adverse effects that we see in aging. And we can begin early in a preventive mode rather than a reactive mode when the damage is already done. Next slide. And then just last, the reason I'm bringing this up is that a year ago, the NCI announced something called the National Cancer Plan. This plan focuses on cancer, but its principles apply to everything we do across health. For example, it emphasizes the need for understanding fundamental biology and how that drives health. It emphasizes a modification of lifestyle to promote health. It emphasizes most of all that if we are to attack successfully the wellness across the lifespan, particularly in aging, it will take an all of society, all of medicine approach, and that everyone has a role in this. And I think that's my last slide. Thank you.
Great, Monica. So it's said that being a patient makes you a better doctor. And I wonder if you have some comments from personal experience about that particular motto.
Oh, certainly. So I was named NCI director in October 2022, and 5 weeks later, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So I've had my own experience with being a cancer patient. I will say, people have all asked me, what was the biggest thing I learned from moving over to being a patient instead of a physician? And maybe it's the researcher I'm sure it's the researcher in me, but I am so profoundly grateful to I added them up, more than 140,000 women who participated in the clinical trials that led to the very successful therapies that I've been able to receive. My prognosis is great. And from the side of a grateful patient, I am so grateful to all of those women who participated in those trials.
You know, you raised, and we were speaking before the formal session started, about the GLP-1 receptor agonists, or incretin mimetics in general. And I guess Dari Mossafarian just wrote up a piece, I think, in JAMA about how it's impossible to embrace these therapies because of, even if we could afford them, the production seems to be very limited. But a question for both of you, maybe you could start with Victor, because you both have these very high-level national perspectives on the issue. How do we face the equitable distribution of the advances that we make with research? I know, Victor, you've had a deep commitment to equity, going back really when you were working with Gary Gibbons in the lab, and when you were the founder of the Global Health Equity Division at the Brigham with Paul Farmer, the late Paul Farmer, and Jim Kim. So I know that you walk the walk as well as talk the talk, but in your national role, how are we going to address the disparities which were thrown into stark relief by the pandemic?
Yeah, Peter, great question. And as I said, my model right now is bench to bedside to population society, because we can't talk about bench to bedside if you don't address the whole issue of the entire population and what does it mean by social factors, hence the issue of equity. equity means that everybody should have the potential to achieve the opportunity to achieve the highest potential, and therefore access to GLP-1 agonists, affordability, you name it, is so important. Now, we've been working on this topic for quite a while at the Academy. In fact, it's our strategic plan, goal number 3 in our first strategic plan that just ended. And the second plan that we just started, the next 5 years, in fact, is also a continuation of this journey. On May 14th, Monica is going to open our meeting for us on this entire issue of equity in science. So we can talk a lot about equity in terms of health equity. How do you make sure that, in fact, drugs are affordable? How do you make sure incentives are aligned? But I think the thing starts with embedding equity in everything that we do. And in this case, for this conversation, embedding equity in the culture of science. That's what the meetings can be all about. That is to say that some years ago, when we started realizing this issue, Peter, you talked about, and with the emergence of genome editing, AI, and things like this, it became very obvious that we need to create a multi-sectoral framework to reduce equity when these technologies emerge. Consequently, we formed a committee, which in fact was co-chaired by Alondra Nelson. She then went off to the White House, but she was co-chair, as is George Daly and the two Boot. We got together really experts, not only in science engineering, but also in industry, in government, with, for example, the Scott Gottlieb as the former commissioner of FDA. We've got MedPAC, many others, to say, how do you solve this problem together? And as a result, we actually created a framework, which is now we're about to pilot to say, Peter, if you have discovery in your lab, and you're going to try to move it forward, how do you start thinking about equity all the way to pricing? That is to say, very early, you need to address equity. So what really came out in the report that we did, led by Keith Yamamoto and Wailu, which is the other piece of it, is that you need to embed equity thinking in everything you do in science. So the day you walk into university, the university president should be talking about how important equity is. If you're going to do research, your training should include the thinking of how to make sure your science is actually achieving equity for society. All the way through funding agency, this is where Monica comes in, and all the way through journal selection, looking at, are you thinking in your major work, have you thought about the relevance of equity? All the way to clinical trial design, you know that well, to all the way to technology transfer. A little bit like asking the question, if I actually discover incretin and the agonist, who do I actually license to? And do I see a sense of equity in their enabling people to have this? And Monica, in talking to Renee ARPA-H, that's what they're doing. ARPA-H is now doing deals with these breakthrough ideas with an equity lens to it to say, in 10 years, you have to promise that, in fact, you can do this or that. And, so I think the entire system, all the way to commercialization, need to have this. Now, that, to me, is the solution long run. But obviously, earlier now, the question you're asking me is drug pricing. How do you address delivery? How do you address supply and demand? These are fundamental issues. And I think what we need to do is live by certain principles. And I certainly strongly support the idea that there should be, in fact, the appropriate drug pricing through whatever mechanism, and look at simplification of, in fact, the process of drug discovery, drug distribution, clinical trials, which are adding up to the cost of drug, and ultimately, sorry to say this, PBM and this complex issue of drug price negotiation. All that has to be part of the equation. Thank you.
Peter,
You're
I
muted.
got muted.
Sorry about that. I was saying, Victor, you have a bully pulpit. for taking this kind of a view. And Monica, as a leader of a major federal agency, has a perhaps less freedom to speak about these things. But you know, even within the NIH, you can affect change for equity. And if Tony Fauci was able to be such an ardent advocate for the PEPFAR program to bring HIV medications to developing countries, to low and middle income countries, that shows the power of what you can do within a federal agency. So Victor really laid down the challenge within the constraints of a federal.
Here's what I'd like Monica to do.
Yeah, exactly, Victor. Thanks.
So Monica will say, we as NIH, we're going to look at, we're going to put a lens of equity on the grant application, etc. Now, I'm not saying you have to have a checkbox, but you have to have thinking about how does this relate to achieving equity if you have this major discovery. It's actually part of I was talking to a journal editor, major journal editor, they say, yes, we are now expecting this as well, to make it as a guideline to say, tell me about how this is going to do that. So Monica, you're the largest biomedical agencies in the world. You can have tremendous influence by saying, when we do this major discovery, genome editing, for example, let's start thinking when you're doing the discovery and translation, how you're going to address issue equity.
Okay, so you've given me my marching orders. I think we had this conversation a year ago, Victor. So let me tell you what we're doing. First, there's two parts of this. First, we need data that includes everyone. We don't have that right now. We need data that includes everyone. So remember I talked in my slides about how we're going to focus on the primary care environment, because the primary care environment can span all of the different diseases that we really want to focus on gathering data from the community, from diverse communities. The primary care research network, which will span all of NIH. Stay tuned for a public announcement about this soon. It will start and it will be focused on all of its initial rollout on meeting the needs of currently underrepresented communities, rural communities, federally qualified health centers, communities serving large minority populations. That's where all of the focus in the initial focus of the new primary care network will be, to bring all of that clinical data into into where we need. The next thing about data is we are working. What do we have? We have electronic health record that goes across the nation. It is a wonderful tool. It is not properly used. There is a large initiative underway now under Health and Human Services that is collaboration between FDA, CMS, CDC, and the Office of the National Coordinator to bring together data from the entire nation with people's consent and knowledge. So this is also going to be a tremendous resource for bringing in the data we need. And then last, okay, we developed this wonderful new gene therapy for sickle cell, some, amazing new advancement. And it's just outrageously expensive. Two pieces of that. I completely agree with the PEPFAR analogy. The reason PEPFAR is so beautiful is we weren't thinking just the United States. We really were citizens of the world with that initiative and thought about the whole world instead of just our own borders for that. So much more of that activity needs to occur. And then, we know that for sickle cell now, CMS has stood up a model to begin to be able to fund this for Medicaid recipients, and give a lot of credit to the administration for putting that forward now, this incredibly challenging therapy. But we absolutely know that's not going to achieve what we need to. We need more science. We need to reduce the cost and increase the accessibility. And then the last thing I'll say is that we within the NIH intramural program are developing a program that, again, this is just an early peek, we'll be ready to announce soon, where when we do interactions with companies to be able to market the drugs that come from NIH research. We will be asking at the time of licensing all of those to have an access plan that is agreed upon with the companies. It'll take into account all of the nuances to make sure that people get what they need, but we're going to do that at the time of licensing so that we're all together on the commitment for access.
Yeah. So Peter, in that context, we're talking to technology transfer offices of major universities. We're trying to move this forward. It's a little bit like when you look at many systems now, I'm sure the Brigham has it, that when you look at which vendor you're going to work with, you look at their commitment to diversity, small business, etc. I think we want university to shine a light to say it's not just the money that you're going to bring in, but it's actually how you're going to help society. And part of that is actually enabling people to have access, and therefore the issue of equity.
Well, it's certainly heartwarming to hear two national leaders speak this language. It's wonderful. And just to underscore, all three of us have been involved in large genetic studies. And as an editor, every week I see half a dozen papers that are probing the UK Biobank, which is a fantastic resource set up by CERS.
Yeah.
Think about it. This is a Northern European, Caucasian, relatively well-off population, and that's not where the bulk of our chronic diseases lie today. With morbidity extension, the chronic diseases are now on the rise worldwide, and we need to make a huge effort to be more diverse in our genetic studies. I'm doing that with a donation from one of my patients. You remember my connections, Victor, to Brazil. Trying to enroll multi-ethnic populations in genetic studies. And I would say that the NIH had a great deal of foresight in our field, in ERIC, the atherosclerosis risk in communities, and the MESA study, the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, in giving us a broader net for our genetic studies. But I'm going to be a little bit daring here and put on the table an issue which I'd really like to do a brain biopsy of two national leaders, and that is the erosion in public trust in science and in medicine and in the profession and research. So we were bantering earlier about supplements and about how many of our patients in the population that we serve is willing to climb on the bandwagon and put down their hard-earned dollars on unproven dietary supplements, particularly to combat chronic diseases and aging. And we have a big disconnect between the evidence base, which all three of us grew up in, and the belief systems which we have to work with our patients on and the population at large. So what steps can we take to restore or to actually mitigate the erosion of public trust in research, in science, and in medicine?
So Peter, before you move off the genetics, I will point you to the All of Us program, which complements the UK Biobank. Now has 3/4 of more than almost 800,000 individuals, of which, almost about 41%, I believe, at last count, are of currently underrepresented populations. And
Right.
we're, the large team that's working on rare diseases has had a major uptick in being able to identify and diagnose rare diseases, and a lot of that has been spurred on by this additional diversity, which was sorely needed. So we can do this, and I think we'll give Dr. Collins good credit for the foresight of standing up All of Us, because it's making a big contribution.
I think what's amazing for all of us is you're recruiting from the community. And
Right.
unlike the UK Biobank, as you said, the majority are people actually who are less represented in the usual clinical trials. They're marginalized community, people of color. It's wonderful.
Well, and there you go. I'll tell you. And how did we get the trust? How did the All of Us team get the trust of those diverse but you know, before that left out individuals, which also are some of the communities that have the biggest challenges with trust. And I think it boils down to one thing, that we're never going to get trust by public service announcements. We're never going to get trust, you know, by, you know, even fighting the social media wars. We get trust human being to human being. And this is what all of us has been able to do. And I recently saw a Pew Trust study asking people across the whole US, who do you trust for health information? And it's, you know, very, very diverse sampling. Who do people trust? They trust their primary care provider.
And nurses.
Number one. And the nurses, and the pharmacists, and they trust pharmacists. And who's, you know, there's a lot lower on the list that they don't trust. So this is why I'm really excited for this very diverse primary care research network, because, and also the EHR-based data ecosystem for research we're bringing in, because we'll also be doing that with people's permission and consent. And if they wish, make it a two-way street with communication back to them, because that's the other way you build trust. You build trust by solving people's problems, by listening to them, and by letting them know what happened, giving them feedback.
Yeah, I totally agree with Monica. And in fact, I think the issue of communication has to be a science itself. We've done a lot of study at Academy on this issue of making sure that communities are being consulted, that you speak to them, that you don't show them with data, but the narratives are much more important. You listen to them first to see what they're really concerned about and where their level of trust. And important, use community leadership, you know, faith-based organizations, barbershop, you name it, to be the means of communication. I think it's really critically important. I totally agree with Monica.
And I want to throw one more thing. You asked me what was the biggest thing I learned from being a cancer patient. Remember, I said, so profoundly grateful to all those women who participated in the research. So that has also led me to have a great passion for making sure that when we work with people in research, they're our equal partners. Right. They are absolutely our equal partners, and approach it with that attitude.
So, Victor, you launched the Global Grand Challenge. I wonder if you could describe that a little bit, where you are in the evolution of your challenge.
Sure. Well, you know, as I said, when we started looking at this field, there wasn't a lot of people working in it. I used to say, if you work across a campus university and ask a young person, what do you work on? It'll be cancer, it'll be cardiovascular, it will be whatever, but rarely someone say, I'm working on aging or health and longevity. So it became very obvious to us, number one, that we need to stimulate the field, capitalize ideas and breakthroughs. That's one part of our grand challenge, which is how to get a lot more people in the field. Now, this is now 10 years ago. Today, you would say that's not a problem, but those days, it was very few. So when we came up with the idea with Tachi Yamada, the late Tachi Yamada, and Bob Horwitz at MIT, the whole idea of a competition using the Gates Foundation Grand Challenge Exploration approach, which is, let's just put out as many grants as possible at a level of $50,000, just to get people interested and to come up with bold idea, no preliminary data needed, 2-page application, and we're just going to fund you, just taking chances. The good news is I have like 13 global collaborators, people you know from Singapore, Japan, UK, EU, and China, Chile, you name it. They all joined this. So consequently, we're able to give out about 150 such awards a year. First round, Tachi's great idea. When we put it out, 1,500 applications globally, covering about 50 different countries and territories. Subsequently, we've now done it for 4 or 5 years, on an average about 1,000 to 1,500. So you can imagine we have now huge number of applications, and we funded about 10%. And what happens is that we use a very streamlined way of of enabling people to apply and to take a chance on them. The second phase is to enable what we call accelerator, which is those which are good, gets the next level of funding at about 500,000 to $1 million. We have J&J, European Investment Bank, and others to support it. And a number of them went on to form companies and others. And now we end up with a grand prize. So we have mobilized tremendous amount of excitement, interest. We hold a summit every year. I would say that, lots of things have happened since we started, along with, of course, as you know, NIH putting a lot more attention to it. By the way, NIH was part of this grand challenge, as well as, in fact, others. And you can have Mahmoud Khan on later on. You can see from Hevolution, which in fact he was part of our grand challenge group, and now investing a huge amount of dollars. You have Alto's laboratory and others. So the science is now going very exciting. The issue now is translation, right? But so we have been very excited to be a catalyst in this area. The other part of Grand Challenge is to look at policy and what do we need to do? Kind of Monica's question about data, about engagement, about government making the right policy, about social, environmental issues, how to make sure, like in Singapore, they adopted our study in a big way. They look at multi-generational housing, where older people, younger people live together, lots of social opportunities, and lots of course, government policies. So we're very excited about this project that we started. We now feel very gratified. There's so much activities. And Peter, along the area that you're working on, there are lots of great ideas of research, of mechanisms, of inflammation, of early detection, you name it.
That's absolutely critical, I think, as we move forward. So, Monica, some of the most gratifying NIH experiences that I've had have been inter-institute forums. And I can remember just a handful of them where there was really cooperation among institutes. And now it's in your bailiwick to break down those silos, as you enunciated earlier. So how can, and I started out by saying we all study the same disease and that the mechanisms are shared. So how are you going to try to address coalescing all of the parochial interests of the different institutes and harnessing all of the brain power and all of the resources to pull in one direction towards solving the problem of healthful aging?
Well, I wish I could take credit, but boy, way before I arrived on the scene here, there have already been some really amazing initiatives that are now well underway that are doing exactly this. I'll give you one really important example, the HEAL initiative. 10 of the 27 institutes and centers are involved in the HEAL initiative. HEAL stands for Helping to End Addiction Long Term, but HEAL takes the approach that people don't use substances, illicit substances, because they're partying. They use illicit substances because they're in pain and suffering, and they're looking for relief. And so it takes an approach across mental health, the two institutes that think about substance abuse, but also the National Cancer Institutes, musculoskeletal pain, all of these areas that all of the institutes are participating. It gets deep into communities, and it's across all 10 institutes and centers approach to ending addiction by treating pain. That's one example. I can give you others. The Recover Initiative for long COVID, many of the institutes and centers heavily involved there. The work that's being done in neurodegenerative diseases. And then finally, the last one I'll give you is now a really across virtually every institute and center focus now on spearheading gene therapies for rare diseases. So it's already happening, and it's happening in a focused way, which I think is the only way to be successful, frankly.
Great. So we're sort of near the time for wrapping up, and let me just ask Victor, starting with Victor, for your bottom line for how we're going to pull together to address the problem of healthy aging and longevity.
Peter, as you said, it takes all of society. I think Monica said that too. We have to see this as an important issue for us. We don't want to see it in a negative way because aging is part of natural history. How to create healthy aging is the question. So we need to think about bringing together, the social factors, the economic issues, the healthcare issues, research and data, innovation, and of course, pretty much everyone needs to solve this problem together. The whole idea is to say, if we can get people healthier, I'm sorry to say this, Peter, look at you and me, we're over 70 years old. We're still actively working, right? Contributing. Imagine that, the workforce have lots of people who are able to continue to contribute and able to actually find meaning in life and not being isolated. They'll be healthier and they'll be more productive. And that's what we need.
Well, I know we have a common mentor, and Monica as well intersected with Dr. Bromwald. And Eugene Bromwald is well over 90, and he's still on our case. I know you met with him recently, and I speak to him quite frequently. So he's an inspiration because his mind is sharp and his ambition is really unextinguished. So that's a model for us all. I agree with you completely.
Yeah. And as you know, the demographic says that the workforce is getting older. There are fewer young people. So we have to find a solution, making society really more enjoyable and healthier for everyone, especially people who are getting older.
Right. And so, Monica, what's your last word about how we can move forward in cooperation to promote healthy longevity?
Well, I think we take the view of health across the lifespan, beginning even before birth. We think about all the influences of health, and they are so many. And this is the beauty of being at NIH, because we really do have a lot of the brain trust that thinks about health literally from the time of conception onto hopefully very, very healthy and long life. And then the other feature I will say that we've all taken on is our mantra is that the work of NIH is not done when we make scientific discoveries. Our work is only done when everyone, all people, are living long and healthy lives.
Well, what a great way to wrap up our conversation. This part of this fabulous get-together, the Fireside Chat, which is going to be followed by a panel. So I'm going to turn it back over to Zan Fleming, who will tell us what the next step is. And let me just say what an honor and pleasure it's been to have this conversation with you, Monica, and Victor as well.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Well, it has been such a wonderful conversation. We cannot thank you enough, Victor and Monica. It really has been inspiring. And I know that this conference will be viewed across the globe with great effect. And who knows how many young people may be inspired by the words they've heard today. So can't thank you both enough. And then our master moderator, Peter Libby, who is going to continue with the next panel. We understand, of course, that Victor and Monica will need to go on to other responsibilities, but we cannot thank you enough for such a wonderful discussion.